Hey guys, what is up? And welcome back. Yes, that is right. I am finally back. Hopefully. I tried this once and failed miserably, so I guess we'll see how this one goes. More importantly, how are you guys doing? Are you good? I hope so. I have been gone forever, and I have missed you guys so much. I am so excited to be here and to hopefully be getting back into the swing of things. It's definitely been quite a journey to get to this point, that's for sure, but all that matters is we're here now. To address the elephant in the room, and no, I'm not referring to my excess postpartum weight. Some people drop weight when they're breastfeeding, and some people hold on to it for dear life, and as you can see, Mother is very much the latter and not the former. So, hi, this is what I look like now, at least for the foreseeable future. But what I actually was referring to is the fact that I am very obviously in a different filming space. To be fully transparent, my typical setup is pretty much right in the middle of my house, and it takes a lot of time to set up and to tear down. I have to move furniture around, and frankly, I'm just not feeling that right now. So hopefully this creates enough visual interest. If by chance you're new here, hi, and sorry. Normally I don't carry on in my intros like this, but I've been gone for a while and I'm pretty nervous. Honestly, I think I'm more nervous now than when I sat down to film my first video. But I'm just going to try and push through, and I'm sure it'll all come back around eventually. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Jessica, and here on my channel I discuss new true crime cases each week. So if you're interested in true crime or just the macabre in general, and you'd like to join me back here each week, then go ahead and subscribe down below. Then we can all find out together collectively if I ever get good at this again. Fingers crossed. In all seriousness, before I go any further, I do want to make you aware that we are going to cover some sensitive topics today. So if you would please take a second to look at the screen for an idea of what topics in particular will either be discussed or heavily implied throughout today's story. If any of these are things that you're not in the headspace to hear about right now, then I do not suggest watching this video. Please do what is best for you. That will always be what's most important to me. Even if that means that you're headed out, I completely understand, and I'm sure that I'll catch you back here very soon for a different case. But for those of you who are sticking around, today we're going to be discussing the story of Teri Jendusa Nicolai. And I am very curious to find out who, if any of you, have heard this story before. It's definitely been covered by a lot of true crime docuseries style TV shows, but as far as YouTube videos and podcasts, not so much. A fact that isn't going to change anytime soon if I don't stop babbling and just get started. Teri Sue Jendusa was born in the mid-60s in the suburbs of Wisconsin. She grew up happily in a stable environment, her parents had a healthy marriage, and she was very close with her 3 siblings. She was energetic and fun-loving, she did well in school, and she had a lot of friends. Overall, she seemed to really enjoy her adolescence. After high school, Teri attended the University of Wisconsin-Parkside in Somers, Wisconsin, where she continued to foster a pretty fruitful social life. And it was through this large group of friends that Teri first met a young man named David Larson in 1983. The two went on to spend a fairly decent amount of time together during their group's frequent outings to local pubs. They always got along really well, and they did genuinely enjoy one another's company. However, it wouldn't be until 12 years later that Teri and Dave's relationship would shift from platonic to romantic. Long after their college days were over, the two happened to reconnect in 1995, just as Teri was coming out of a long-term relationship and Dave was coming out of the Marine Corps. As luck would have it, they were both looking for a serious relationship, they both wanted to start a family, and they'd known each other for years, so they already had an established friendship. On paper, it kind of seemed perfect, like things were just falling right into place. Teri later admitted that she kind of feels as though she rushed into things with Dave, that because she felt as though her biological clock was ticking, she overlooked and underanalyzed some pretty serious red flags throughout the beginning of their relationship. Most notably, she ignored his temper and his very obvious disdain for women. But while Dave's temper certainly wasn't Teri's favorite quality, it never really made her feel unsafe around him. His explosive anger never really seemed to be directed at her. It was mostly directed at people like waiters and waitresses, hotel clerks, cashiers, hospitality workers in general. He was basically a Karen before we as a society had really started categorizing Karens as Karens. And while Teri was often quite embarrassed by Dave's behavior, she could never imagine a day where she'd actually be on the receiving end of one of his outbursts. And for a while, she wasn't. It wasn't until after they'd tied the knot in April of 1996 that Teri realized she might have made a mistake in overlooking Dave's obvious character flaws. They were actually only 4 days into their 2-week honeymoon trip to Hawaii when Dave hit Teri for the first time. And it was over something so stupid. He didn't like what she was wearing, and when he told her to change and she refused, he hit her and told her that now that they were married, she was to do whatever he said. That she was, quote, bought and paid for. So that about sums up Dave. Things were okay again for a while when they got back from their honeymoon, but when you're dealing with someone like Dave, it's safe to assume that any good times are going to be swiftly followed by some not so good times. And as time went on, he became increasingly verbally and physically abusive towards Teri. His belief was that their marriage was an unbreakable contract and that by having said "I do," Teri had willingly agreed to follow every rule ever laid out by Dave. That she was now required to live according to his standards. He also believed that failure to comply warranted extreme acts of violence as punishment. During their marriage, Teri left Dave, I think, like 5 separate times, only returning home once he agreed to see a marriage counselor and to attend anger management classes. Both of which he would adamantly refuse to do once Teri was home and things had kind of blown over. And then the cycle would repeat. I always feel the need to say this in cases that involve DV, but please keep any and all victim-blamey type opinions to yourself. The only person who has the right to pass those judgments on Teri's life is Teri herself, as she is quite literally the only one who lived it. It never has and it never will be that easy for a victim of DV to just leave. You have to take into consideration that Dave controlled every aspect of Teri's life. He'd forced her to quit her job, he'd isolated her from her friends, he'd forced her to give up her car in exchange for one that was registered to him, he'd withheld all of their financial information from her, forcing her to live on a budget of about $25 a week, which she was required to document with receipts so that she could prove she was spending her allowance responsibly. Rightfully so, she felt stuck. She truly felt as though her best choice was to just put her head down, follow his rules, obey his commands, and just try to do everything he wanted as perfectly as she possibly could. And this, my friends, is the sad truth behind DV. Constant abuse like this can really eat away at a person's confidence and self-esteem, and eventually they can end up believing that what's happening to them is their own fault, which it is most certainly not. And eventually, Teri did realize that no matter how hard she tried to be Dave's perfect little trophy wife, he would always be able to find something that she was doing wrong in his eyes. He could and would always find something that he could use as an excuse to take out his pent-up frustrations on her. It didn't matter how trivial or baseless it was, if his imagination could conjure it up, he would most certainly hold Teri accountable for it. Sadly, though, by the time that Teri had this epiphany and genuinely began planning the end of her marriage, she found out that she was pregnant. And while she was totally and completely thrilled to be pregnant and to be becoming a mother, she was not naive to the fact that her current situation likely wouldn't be an ideal one to raise a child in. But she knew that Dave had always wanted kids, so deep down she hoped that maybe now that she was pregnant and he was going to be a dad and they were going to have a family, maybe he could change. And while Dave did treat Teri considerably better while she was pregnant, as soon as she gave birth, their dynamic shifted back, and Teri once again found herself on the receiving end of her husband's wrath. Neither the birth of their daughter Amanda in 1997, nor the birth of their daughter Holly in 1999 would truly change Dave. And finally, during a fight in late 1999, Teri decided that she had had enough. I've seen this fight to end all fights reported 2 different ways. I've seen it reported that Teri and Dave were fighting and he screamed at their oldest daughter, Amanda. And I've seen it reported that they were fighting and Dave pushed Teri while she was holding their youngest daughter, Holly. Either way, it seems as though the takeaway here is that they were fighting and Dave took it too far this time by involving their children in some capacity. And seeing this pushed Teri over the edge. She knew right then and there that she could not let her children grow up like this, and that she needed to leave Dave for good. So she packed up what she could, gathered up the girls, and headed to a women's shelter where she stayed while she filed for divorce. But if there's one thing we've learned about Dave, it's that He's not going down without a fight, and their divorce proceedings were no exception. Dave drug his feet for so long when it came to providing requested documents that he was actually held in contempt of court. He seriously thought that if he could somehow stall out the proceedings and badmouth Teri for long enough, that things might actually turn out in his favor. But unbelievably, cussing out judges and going against his lawyer on multiple occasions and basically leading a smear campaign against Teri did not tip the scales in his direction. It's shocking, I know. Teri was ultimately granted the divorce, which was finalized on January 31st, 2001, finally severing the marital ties that had bound her to this lunatic for the longest 3 years of her life. Unfortunately, though, even with the finalization of their divorce, Dave was not completely out of Teri's life for good. Despite her vivid accounts of the living hell her marriage was, a judge still awarded joint custody of the girls to Teri and Dave. So she would still have to see this man who had terrorized her for so long at their court-ordered custody exchanges. Exchanges which, mind you, Dave insisted they do at his home. I'm unclear as to how or why he got to be the one to dictate this, but nevertheless, Dave refused to do them anywhere other than his home, no matter how desperately Teri begged him to do them in public. Being ordered by the law to routinely see Dave and to constantly be reminded of what a huge nightmare being married had been for her left Teri fairly certain that she would never be open to the idea of remarrying or even dating ever again. She tried it. Hadn't been great. So she really just wanted to focus on herself and her daughters moving forward. But you know what they say, love happens when you least expect it. Just before her divorce, Teri had joined the Bel Canto Community Chorus, and it was at these choir practices that she would later meet a man named Nick Nicolai. Nick was immediately attracted to Teri, but knowing that she was in the middle of a divorce, he respectfully gave her some space. But over time, the two became friends, and their friendship very naturally progressed into a romantic relationship. Nick pretty much swept Teri right off her feet. He was sweet and respectful of her, and he was really empathetic to everything she'd been through in her first marriage. Not to mention that he lovingly embraced her daughters with open arms and treated them like they were his very own. The two officially started dating around May of 2001 and were together for about 2.5 years before they married in October of 2003. And with these nuptials, Teri finally felt as though she had the stable and happy family unit she had always wanted. Any guesses how Dave felt about this? If you guessed not great, you would be correct. Even though he and Teri's divorce had been finalized for almost 3 years before Teri remarried, Dave did not care. He didn't believe in divorce, and therefore he was under the impression that, in the eyes of God, he and Teri were still married. That she was still his property, and that by remarrying Nick, she had betrayed him and gone against God's will. Despite the countless horrendous things that Dave had put Teri through over the course of their marriage, the way he saw things, Teri alone was at fault for the dissolution of their family, and he fully intended to make her pay for what he believed she had done to him. Leaving court the day that their divorce was finalized, Dave even told Teri that one day he would make sure that she regret divorcing him. And even though Teri was very scared of her ex-husband and had learned to take his threats seriously, by this point, she honestly believed that she'd already lived through the worst that he could ever do to her. All she wanted to do was just move on with her life, which she greatly succeeded in doing over the next few years. She'd remarried a wonderful man, she'd started rebuilding her career, and on Friday, January 30th, 2004, she and Nick found out that they were going to be having a baby of their very own. They were so excited. Not only had they wanted this, but Holly and Amanda had also been talking about wanting a little sibling. So they were especially excited to get the girls back from Dave the next day so that they could tell them the good news and celebrate with them. Which brings us to Saturday, January 31st, 2004, which coincidentally happened to be the 3-year anniversary of the day that Teri and Dave's divorce was finalized. It was a particularly cold day in Wisconsin, freezing temperatures, high winds, and tons of snow on the ground. To put it into perspective, people recall having trouble breathing outside that day because it was so cold, which sounds awesome. And by awesome, I mean terrible. But the weather was the last thing on Teri's mind. All she could think about was how excited she was to see her girls and to tell them about the new baby. As she got ready to leave to go and pick them up from Dave's, Nick asked if she wanted him to tag along, but Teri declined his offer. She knew from past experiences that all that stood to do was make a tense situation even more hostile and uncomfortable. So she went alone, hoping to avoid any additional unnecessary confrontation with Dave. She got to his house around 10 a.m., even calling him on her way to let him know exactly when she would be there. So admittedly, she was slightly irritated when Dave opened the door and told her that the girls weren't quite ready to go yet. But it wasn't worth an argument, so begrudgingly, she asked him to please hurry them along, that she would wait outside in the freezing cold while he finished getting them ready. And for almost 20 minutes, she stood outside, pacing around the driveway, trying to keep warm as she waited for Dave to send out her daughters. Finally, the door opened again, but much to Teri's surprise, she still did not see her daughters. Instead, Dave came out and told her that the girls were hiding inside and that they wanted her to come in and find them, which he invited her in to do. Right away, Teri felt really uneasy with this. It all seemed very odd. Dave had not allowed her inside his home since the day she left him, but now he was just inviting her in out of the blue. But again, it was freezing cold. She was tired of waiting, and she really didn't want to disappoint her daughters. So she brushed off her suspicions and proceeded inside, playfully calling out to her daughters as she made her way through the home. Almost instantly, though, Teri's suspicions were confirmed, as the next thing she felt was a searing blow to the head. She didn't know it right away, but her ex-husband had just struck her with full force in the head with a baseball bat. And as she fell to the floor, he continued hitting her while screaming things at her like, "You always said I was abusing you, and now you can see what abuse really is." During this attack, Dave hit Teri upwards of 20 times until she completely blacked out. She came to find that Dave had started binding her from head to toe with duct tape. She had absolutely no idea what he intended to do with her, but it was becoming pretty obvious that whatever it wasn't good. Feeling desperate and terrified, she began trying to bargain with him. She promised to drop their custody battle. She promised to drop his child support. Anything she could think to offer him, she tried it. But he was having none of it. Instead, he was far too concerned with the fact that somehow, while he'd been trying to tape up Teri's ankles, her pants had come down, and he was convinced that she had done this on purpose to make him look bad, to make it look as if the situation was something it wasn't. "I hate to break it to you, Dave, but my guy, the only person making you look bad is you." A concept that eludes him even to this day, but we'll get there. Once he'd finished excessively binding Teri, he placed her bruised and bleeding into a trash can, which he then packed full of snow before loading into the bed of his truck. So not only has he beaten her within an inch of her life, he has now shoved her half naked into a garbage can and covered her with snow on basically the coldest day that's ever happened. I think I can safely speak for all of us when I say that this doesn't sound like the best way to start off your weekend. But even in the truly awful position she now found herself in, Teri did have one tiny shred of hope left, because what Dave had somehow overlooked while brutalizing and restraining his ex-wife was the fact that she still had her cell phone in her jacket pocket. And even though her face was completely covered in duct tape and so swollen that she couldn't even open her eyes, Teri still managed to break the binding on her wrists, wiggle her phone out of her pocket, and call 911. She knew that because of the duct tape on her face, she was going to have a difficult time relaying information to the operator. So throughout the call, she just repeated Dave's address over and over and over again, as many times as she possibly could, which thankfully was enough to get police and rescue dispatched to the home. However, by the time they got there, Dave had already loaded Holly and Amanda into the truck with him and left the house. Police responding to the call actually passed Dave's truck as he drove away. He drove right past them with Teri hostage in the back and her vehicle hitched to his. Teri could very clearly hear the sirens as they passed her by and faded away in the opposite direction. She felt completely defeated. They had just unknowingly likely missed their chance to save her life. When police arrived to Dave's home, they were under the impression that someone inside was in distress. Therefore, when they knocked and no one answered the door, they were legally allowed to force their way in to assess the situation. They looked around, hoping to find and help whoever had made the 911 call, but no one was there. So as neighbors began to gather around to see what was going on, police began asking them questions and quickly gained some insight into who Dave was, as well as he and Teri's dynamic. It did not take them long to piece together that something much larger than they'd originally anticipated was likely going on here. They just had absolutely no idea what that something was. Meanwhile, poor Teri is freezing to death in a trash can in her ex-husband's truck, headed God knows where, fading in and out of consciousness, as you might expect one to after taking a baseball bat to the head repeatedly. However, she was still thinking as clearly as ever. And during one of the moments that she had come back to, Teri called her husband to tell him what had happened. Teri tried desperately through the duct tape still covering her face to convey to Nick exactly what Dave had done to her and what was going on. And as horrified as he was to hear this, and as much as he wanted nothing more than to comfort his wife, he knew that her best chance of getting the help she needed was to hang up with him so they could both call the police. So they hung up with one another and they both called 911. Side note, it just started absolutely pouring rain here. Oh! So if you can hear that, I was gonna say I'm sorry, but honestly, I'm not.
I can't control the weather!
Just try to ignore it. When Nick placed his call, he actually spoke to the same Racine County Dispatch Center that Teri had when she made her first call. So for the police at Dave's, the pieces were starting to finally come together to form a bigger, albeit grim, picture of the situation they had at hand. Teri's call, on the other hand, proved less beneficial. Unfortunately, by the time she made her second call, she was no longer in Racine County, and no one in Milwaukee County, where her call did route to, had any idea of how much danger Teri was in, which is very apparent when you hear the recording of the 911 call. I want to preface my harsh critique of this call by saying that I completely understand that in order to mentally cope with being a 911 dispatcher, it is necessary to disconnect emotionally. I get that, but I think there is a huge difference between disconnecting emotionally to preserve your own well-being and having a flagrant disregard for the well-being of the person that is on the other end of the call. With that said, here is Teri's second 911 call.
What do you need? What do you need?
Fired. Seriously though, I cannot wrap my head around the fact that that call actually happened. I guess the operator tried to explain later that she thought it was a prank call, but unless the person on the other line starts cracking knock-knock jokes or something, it's probably not in anyone's best interest to make reckless assumptions like that. Ooh, and what really pisses me off about this call is that a lot of media sources that cover this case try and omit this part of the story. They either leave it out completely or they gloss over it like the call wasn't the complete and total shortfall that it was. You heard it. Teri blacked out, and this woman with venom in her voice asked if she was going to talk to her or just heavy breathe. I'm sorry, but in my very unprofessional opinion, I think you can tell quite easily that something is very wrong with Teri on that call. I could go on and on and on about how frustrated that 911 call makes me, but I will spare you and move on. When Teri regained her consciousness again and saw that they were still moving, in hopes that she might be seen and rescued by someone in a passing vehicle, she decided to stick her hand up and out of the garbage can and begin waving it around. And in doing this, she did catch someone's attention. The problem was that someone was Dave. And he was pissed. How dare Teri have the audacity to try and save herself? He quickly pulled over and, fuming with rage, walked around to the back of the truck, struck Teri again with the bat, and told her that if she tried another stunt like that, he would not hesitate to shoot her. And while I'm sure that his threats were absolutely terrifying, what happened next broke her even more. As Dave made his way back to the driver's side door, Teri's cell phone rang, and Dave heard it. He went back to the trash can and snatched it away from her. The one lifeline that she'd managed to cling onto through this whole ordeal was now gone, rendering her totally and completely isolated from the outside world. It was at that moment, as Teri felt the truck begin to move again, that she decided her best chance of making it out of that trash can alive was to pretend that she wasn't, be as silent as possible, and to play dead. A strategy that she later put into effect as she felt the truck come to a stop and Dave unload the trash can from the back. She had no idea where she was, and she had no idea that Dave's plan was to leave her for dead in a storage locker. But she was confident that it was in her best interest for Dave to believe that she was already dead. What she didn't know at the time was just how close to death she actually already was. He wheeled the trash can into the unit, duct taped it shut, pushed it in the corner, and piled a bunch of boxes on top of it. He was determined to make sure that she was totally and completely trapped. And once he was satisfied that she was, he turned and left, slamming the metal roll-up door behind him and sealing Teri into a makeshift tomb. By this time, back at Dave's house, police were really ramping up their search efforts for Teri. Even with barely anything to go off of, they knew they had to do whatever they could with the little they had because it was obvious to everyone that time was of the essence. They issued Amber Alerts for Holly and Amanda, they put out APBs for Dave and Teri's vehicles, and they attempted to ping both of their cell phones. They also re-entered Dave's home to perform a more thorough search, which was no easy task. Because if old boy hadn't ended up on Investigation Discovery, he'd have ended up on A&E. Dude was a straight-up hoarder. Old food and dirty dishes laying around, laundry all over the floor, just clutter everywhere. Junk from floor to ceiling with very small walkways cleared to make it possible to navigate through the home. Thankfully, during this rendezvous through Dave's pigsty, police were able to uncover some important evidence. They found Teri's pants, which had duct tape and blood on them. But most unsettling of all, they found a massive blood stain on the carpet. And based off the size of the stain, they could tell that whoever's blood it was, presumably Teri's, had to be in pretty bad shape, and that if they didn't find her soon, she very likely was not going to make it. But every avenue they seemed to explore just continued to turn up more and more dead ends. They had tried desperately to be concise in the investigation, only directing energy and manpower into leads that they genuinely believed could amount to something. But by nightfall, police had no choice but to broaden their search to encompass basically anywhere and everywhere Dave had literally ever been, whether they had a lead or not. And this actually ended up being a blessing in disguise because they wound up spotting Dave just heading into work for his shift that night, as if the whole county hadn't just spent the entire day looking for him. They pulled him over cautiously and approached the truck, expecting to be confronted by a homicidal, kidnapping, trigger-happy maniac. But surprisingly, when they got up to the truck and finally put eyes on the man that had eluded them for so many hours, they found that David Larson, at least in that moment, was actually cool, calm, collected, and most notably, alone. Teri and her daughters were nowhere in sight. And Dave was quick to slap on the befuddled ex-husband act. He was just completely incapable of grasping why he could possibly be so sought after by police. So rather than confront him, they went right along with it, employing the old,
"Hey man, some crazy shit's gone down today, and even though we know you're totally not involved, we do have a couple questions for you, so if you wouldn't mind just coming down to the station with us, it'll be super cash, and we'd really appreciate it."
Approach. And Dave agreed. But it was obvious to everyone as soon as Dave sat down in the interview room that he felt as though he was untouchable. He was extremely arrogant. And while it only took Dave a few minutes to tell police that Holly and Amanda were safe at his girlfriend's house, explaining that he'd been forced to drop the girls off there after Teri had failed to show up to pick them up that morning, he then proceeded to drone on and on and on about how horrible Teri was, how she'd always been the bad guy, and how she had been putting him through hell for years. Which I honestly think he genuinely believed, but that's really neither here nor there. I imagine it was insufferable to listen to Dave rant and rave and carry on like that, just dropping lie after lie after lie. But sometimes the best way to suss out the truth is to let someone back themselves into a corner of lies, which is exactly what Dave would eventually do as he tried to paint a very innocent picture of what his day had looked like. He told police how he'd woken up that morning and made breakfast for he and the girls, gotten them ready, and waited patiently for Teri to pick them up until 11:30 a.m., which is when he was ultimately forced to give up, wrangle the girls, and drop them off to his girlfriend. Unfortunately for Dave, that one tiny little chicken McNugget of information was the start of his undoing. Teri's first 911 call clocked in at 10:57 a.m., and police had responded to Dave's house just 6 minutes later at 11:03 a.m. which, if my math is correct, is 27 minutes before 11:30. And you know who 100% definitely for sure was not there when police arrived? That would be Dave. Whoopsies. Now, once they caught Dave in this lie, they completely flipped the script on him and confronted him with everything they knew. They hit him with the blood at the house, Teri's pants, the 911 calls. I mean, they hammered him hard.
That's what she said.
And as investigators outlined the mountain of evidence they had against him, they noticed something that, up to that point, everyone, including Dave, had overlooked. They noticed that this man, while suspected of violently assaulting his ex-wife, had unknowingly agreed to come to the police station and answer questions about her disappearance while sporting her blood on his pants. When that was pointed out to him, did he try and throw it in reverse real quick. He tried to backpedal the wheels off his initial story, and he did not do a good job. He dead ass tried to tell these detectives that while he was packing up the girls' school bags that morning, Teri had snuck into his home, dropped trowel, and attacked him with a hammer. He continued on, stating that thankfully he'd managed to see her before she could strike him, and that strictly in self-defense, he'd been forced to incapacitate her with a baseball bat that he had nearby. But from there, he blacked out and had absolutely no idea what happened or where Teri was. He was steadfast in the fact that he simply could not remember what he had done with her. He'd lost her. A human person. Sure, Dave. Now, brace yourself because this next part's pretty shocking. But police really weren't buying this. I know, he had me convinced too, but for some reason, they just did not believe him. So they reminded him that it was painfully cold outside, and that if there was even a slight chance that Teri was still alive, he should drop the act and help them save her. If for no other discernible reason, he should at least do it for his daughters. They were trying desperately at this point to just appeal to his humanity. The problem there was that he did not have any. A fact that they were swiftly reminded of when, despite their pleas, Dave just smiled, yawned, and told them that he wished he could help, but he was tired and he needed a break. Basically, in a roundabout way, saying that no matter what, he was going to do whatever he could to make sure that by the time Teri was found, she would be dead. Which is a thought process that I do not understand. Sir, you have been caught red-handed and bloody pantsed. Wouldn't you rather go down for attempted murder at this point rather than murder? I mean, you'd think, but apparently it was so incredibly important to Dave that Teri pay for what he felt she'd done to him that he was willing to sacrifice himself and his freedom in the process. And there was nothing the investigators could do about it. If someone asks for a break during an interrogation, after a certain amount of time, you have to give it to them. Or later, the whole interrogation could be considered coercive. So investigators had no choice but to detain Dave, strip him of his personal belongings, and give him the break he requested. Little did they know that this would actually turn out to be best case scenario. Because while taking stock of Dave's personal belongings, investigators actually caught a break of their very own. Remember how I said that Dave's house was a disgusting and cluttered mess? Well, so was his wallet. He seemed to have held on to business cards and receipts from basically everywhere he'd ever been his whole life, including a business card for a storage facility in Wheeling, Illinois. And this card in particular stuck out to police because, remember, Dave lived in Wisconsin, almost 60 miles north of the facility. So it just seemed really random. What purpose does it really serve someone to store their belongings that far from their home? Realistically, I'm sure that there's plenty of plausible, innocent explanations, but they were running out of time and getting pretty desperate for leads. They really didn't have a choice other than to follow up on anything that they felt was even halfway suspicious. So they reached out to the storage facility, and through speaking with the attendant, they were able to confirm that not only did Dave have a unit rented at the facility, but that he had actually accessed it just hours after Teri had gone missing. And just like that, their little hunch was starting to feel more and more like a legitimate lead. To reiterate, for what feels like the billionth time, police were working frantically against the clock, and this storage facility was about an hour away. So before they committed hours of the very small amount of time they had left to potentially following a dead-end lead, investigators first asked the facility attendant to go and scope out Dave's locker, see if maybe by some chance he could hear or see anything unusual. And after waiting patiently on hold for a few minutes, the guy clicked back onto the line, super frantic and totally out of breath, and told them that it sounded like someone might actually be stuck inside the unit. And that was all they needed to hear. It was go time. They told the attendant to hang up and call his local law enforcement, that they were on their way, but if they were right about what they thought was happening, there was not a second to be spared. So while Racine County Police made the drive to Wheeling, the facility attendant did as he was told and called 911. And within minutes, the Wheeling police were dispatched to the facility, arriving pry bar in hand, ready to bust into Dave's locker. Y'all, we have got to stop renting storage units to men named Dave. If you want to know why, you can feel free to click here, or you can just take my word for it that we're 2 for 2 on them using them for evil. Anyways, once they got inside and took a quick scan of Dave's unit, I do not like how that sounds. Once they got inside and took a look around Dave's storage locker, they started to lose hope. They didn't see anything at first, and they also didn't hear anything anymore either. All they initially saw were some boxes, some shelves, and a trash can. They were actually starting to worry that they might be in the wrong unit when one of the officers noticed that the trash can they'd all seen was duct taped shut. And one by one, they each realized that if Teri was in that storage unit, the only place she could be was inside that trash can. So very carefully, they removed the tape, they opened the lid, and they found 38-year-old Teri Sue Jendusa Nicolai in the fetal position, frostbitten, bound with duct tape, covered in blood, and barely clinging to life. That's right. Teri had somehow managed to survive in that trash can, half naked, bleeding, and freezing for 27 hours. That being said, she was not doing well. She had lost a ton of blood. Her head was swollen, her body temperature had dropped to 86 degrees. She had horrible frostbite on her toes and feet. She could barely stay conscious, and she had undoubtedly suffered immense mental trauma. And this was just what they could visually determine right away. What they couldn't see was that her blood pressure was low, her respiratory rate was low, her kidneys were shutting down. When I said she wasn't doing well, I meant it. But she was alive. It was about 1:30 p.m. on February 1st, 2004, when Teri was rushed from the storage facility to the hospital. She was in critical condition, and honestly, her care team was pretty sure she wasn't going to make it. But after almost 2 months in the hospital, she did manage to make almost a full recovery. I say almost a full recovery because she did lose all 10 of her toes to frostbite, and devastatingly, she miscarried she and Nick's baby. But at the end of the day, she was alive, and that in and of itself was a miracle. David Larson was tried and ultimately convicted of attempted murder, kidnapping, obstructing child custody, and interstate domestic violence. He's currently serving life in prison. He tried to appeal his conviction in 2010, claiming he'd been subjected to double jeopardy by being prosecuted at both the state and federal level. However, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his claim, stating that because the federal charges had been different from the state charges, double jeopardy actually was not an issue here. But if we know Dave, and by now I think we do, obviously he's not going to just take no for an answer. So instead, he decided he would just bust right the out of prison. Yeah, after his appeal was denied, the prison discovered what they referred to as a complex escape plan that Dave was planning to use to free himself from Waupun Correctional Institute. I'm fairly certain I pronounced that wrong, so feel free to drag me in the comments if you're from Wisconsin or just know things. But apparently Dave was planning to fake some sort of medical emergency and I guess somehow escape during transport to an offsite medical facility. I'm not sure of the specifics, but obviously he was unsuccessful. And to rub salt in the wound, Wisconsin also later ordered Dave to pay Teri $3.4 million, as well as $300,000 to Nick, Amanda, and Holly. He tried to combat this by filing for bankruptcy, but his request was denied because his debts were, quote, the result of his own willful and malicious injury of another entity. And I wish I could say that that was the end of the legal proceedings, but over the years, Dave made sort of a habit of dragging Teri back to court over anything and everything he could possibly think of. He made numerous requests to be allowed visitation with his daughters. He made numerous requests to have his child support requirements lowered or just forgiven altogether. In my opinion, he was trying to do basically anything he could to continuously drag Teri back to court so that she never forgot about him. From what I could gather, these petitions and requests never went in his favor, but honestly, it really doesn't matter at this point because Holly and Amanda are both in their 20s, so his ties to Teri have finally been officially severed. And beyond that, David Larson remains incarcerated at Poon Correctional Institute to this day. As for Teri, despite everything Dave has put her through, she has actually stated that she views him as the victim in this case. That even though he did try to make her a victim, all he managed to do was to ruin his own life. And if that ain't some strong-ass, glass-half-full type thinking, I don't know what is. Teri and Nick did go on to welcome a son of their own following her recovery, and Teri now works as a public speaker, helping to educate women on how to avoid and escape abusive relationships. She has also become a victims advocate and spokesperson for victims' rights in Wisconsin. Since her attack, she's played a part in drafting laws such as the Wisconsin SAFE Act and Wisconsin's Marcy's Law, in addition to the fact that she also partners closely with Generations Against Bullying. Basically, she is a force to be reckoned with. And that, my friends, is the incredible survival story of Teri Jendusa Nicolai. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Before you head out, if you wouldn't mind to give this video a thumbs up, it only takes a second and it really helps out the channel a lot, so thanks in advance. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel, as well as turn on your post notifications so you don't miss my next video. I am so incredibly happy to be back, and I'm really hoping to be able to upload pretty consistently, but if I'm being honest with myself as well as you guys, I have no idea what my upload schedule is actually going to look like for the next little while. So having your post notifications turned on will help make sure that you're notified as soon as I do upload. Really quickly, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being so patient and understanding while I was gone. Whether you've been here a while or you're new and you took a chance on me and subscribed in my absence, I appreciate you all more than I can say, and I can't wait to see you back here next time. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.